there comes a point in some relationships where you feel like something isn't right. Maybe you've been trying to ignore it, hoping things will get better, but deep down, you know you've changed. You've grown, evolved, and yet the relationship stays the same. The truth is, not everyone is meant to grow with you. Sometimes the very thing holding you back from the love, peace, and happiness you deserve is the relationship you're afraid to walk away from. There was a time when talking to him felt effortless, like the words just flowed and every conversation left you feeling connected and understood. But now you find yourself forcing the dialogue, searching for things to say, or even worse, feeling completely uninterested in the conversations you do have. When you've outgrown a man, one of the first signs is that your conversations no longer excite or engage you. The things he used to say that once caught your attention now feel repetitive, unimportant, or even annoying. You might notice that you'd rather be talking to someone else, your friends, your coworkers, or even just sitting in silence, rather than engaging in another conversation that leads nowhere. It's not necessarily that he's changed or that he's done something wrong, but the dynamic between you has shifted. Your mind and heart are in a different place, and the way you communicate reflects that. You might notice that the depth you once had is no longer there. Where you used to talk about your dreams, your passions, and your future, now the conversation is surface level, filled with routine questions and empty exchanges that lack real connection. You might try to spark something, to bring up meaningful topics, but he either doesn't engage the way he used to, or he no longer has the ability to meet you at the level you need. You may even start to dread the conversations, feeling like you're carrying the weight of making the dialogue interesting or keeping things going. You notice that the jokes that once made you laugh now fall flat, or the deep conversations you once had are no longer fulfilling. You might find yourself zoning out when he talks, not out of rudeness, but because what he's saying simply doesn't capture your attention the way it used to. Instead of feeling energized after talking to him, you feel drained, unfulfilled, or simply indifferent. Sometimes the things that once made you feel connected now highlight the distance between you. You've grown, evolved, and developed new perspectives, but he's still the same. And while stability can be a good thing, when one person is growing and the other remains stagnant, it creates an emotional and intellectual gap that becomes hard to ignore. Maybe you try to introduce new topics, share new insights, or bring him into your evolving world, but he either doesn't understand or doesn't seem interested. You realize that you're no longer speaking the same language, and that realization alone makes you feel disconnected. A lack of engaging conversation can also reveal deeper issues. If you're not excited to talk to him anymore, it could be because you're no longer emotionally invested in the relationship. It could be that you've already checked out in your mind and your heart is slowly following. When you're truly connected with someone, even the simplest conversations feel meaningful. But when that connection starts to fade, the words exchanged between you become nothing more than routine noise. You feel like you're holding yourself back, dimming your light, or shrinking to make the relationship work. You notice that the things that once excited you now feel like a burden because you're afraid they'll create distance between you and him. When you've outgrown a man, one of the clearest signs is that you no longer feel free to be yourself. Instead of embracing your growth and stepping into who you are meant to be, you start making yourself smaller, avoiding certain topics, or downplaying your ambitions because deep down, you know he can't keep up. At first, it may not even be something you're fully aware of. It starts with little things scoozing not to share something exciting about your life because you don't think he'll understand, or feeling like you have to explain yourself every time you talk about your goals. Then it turns into bigger things, like hesitating before making decisions that are best for you because you're worried about how he'll react. Maybe he's not outright telling you to stay the same, but you feel it in his energy, in the way he responds, or in how he doesn't support the changes you're making. Instead of feeling encouraged, you feel resistance, as if your growth is becoming a problem in the relationship. You may even notice that when you try to have deep conversations about your dreams or the person you're becoming, he dismisses them or doesn't take them seriously. Where you once felt seen and understood, now you feel like you're speaking a language he can't comprehend. And when you stop feeling understood in a relationship, it becomes harder and harder to stay. Sometimes it's not that he's trying to hold you back on purpose, it's just that he's comfortable where he is and your evolution makes him uncomfortable. He sees you growing, changing, becoming more confident, and he either doesn't know how to adapt or feels insecure about what that means for him. Maybe he used to feel like he was leading, but now he senses that you're outgrowing him. And instead of rising to meet you at your level, he stays the same. You start feeling like you have to slow down or dim your light just to keep the relationship from falling apart. A relationship should never make you feel like you have to choose between your growth and your connection. The right man will encourage your evolution, celebrate your wins, and be inspired by the person you are becoming. But when you've outgrown a man, you feel like you have to suppress parts of yourself just to keep the peace. You find yourself avoiding certain conversations, hesitating before making decisions, and questioning whether you should pursue the things that make you happy. You may even start second guessing yourself, wondering if you're asking for too much or if you should slow down so the relationship can survive. But the truth is, a relationship that requires you to hold yourself back is already falling apart. You feel emotionally disconnected from him. And no matter how much you try to revive the connection, it just doesn't feel the same. In the beginning, the relationship may have been filled with passion, deep conversations, and a sense of excitement, but over time, something changed. You no longer feel drawn to him the way you once did. And instead of looking forward to spending time together, you often find yourself feeling indifferent or even drained by his presence. You try to convince yourself that maybe it's just a phase, but deep down, you know that something within you has shifted. This emotional disconnect isn't just about temporary boredom or routine. It's a sign that the relationship is no longer feeding your soul. You may notice that the little things that used to make you happy no longer have the same effect. The way he talks, the things he does, the dynamic you once enjoyed, it all feels different now. Even when he tries to be affectionate or do something special for you, it doesn't bring you the same joy it used to. It's as if the connection has faded, and no matter how much you try to rekindle it, it's just not there anymore. You might catch yourself feeling more at peace when you're alone than when you're with him. Instead of feeling emotionally fulfilled by your interactions, you feel exhausted or even frustrated. The conversations feel repetitive, lacking depth, or forced. You don't feel inspired by him anymore, and instead of growing together, it feels like you're just going through the motions. You've outgrown the relationship because you've evolved, and the connection that once felt right no longer aligns with who you are now. Sometimes this disconnect happens gradually. At first, you brush it off as stress or a rough patch, but as time passes, you realize it's not just a phase, it's a shift in who you are and what you need. You start recognizing that your values, your mindset, and even your desires have changed. Where you once felt in sync, now there's a gap between you. And the more you grow, the wider that gap becomes. It doesn't mean he's a bad person, but it does mean that the relationship is no longer serving you in the way it once did. When you feel emotionally disconnected, you also start to lose the motivation to invest in the relationship. You no longer feel the urge to share your thoughts, your feelings, or your experiences with him. You may even stop seeking his advice or input because deep down, you don't feel that he truly understands you anymore. The relationship that once felt like home now feels unfamiliar. And instead of feeling like a safe space, it feels like a place you no longer belong. You may notice that you're spending more time focusing on yourself, your goals, and your happiness outside of the relationship. While personal growth is always important, When you start feeling like your relationship is holding you back rather than enhancing your life, it's a clear sign that you've outgrown it. You find yourself making excuses for his behavior more often than you should, constantly justifying his actions to yourself and others. In the beginning, you may have overlooked small red flags, convincing yourself that no one is perfect and that relationships require compromise. But over time, those small issues have turned into patterns, and deep down, you know something isn't right. You keep telling yourself that he'll change, that things will get better, or that you just need to be more patient. But if you're being honest with yourself, you know you're making excuses for things that should have been addressed a long time ago. Maybe he doesn't show up for you emotionally the way you need him to. Maybe he dismisses your feelings or doesn't prioritize your happiness the way you prioritize his. Perhaps he makes promises that he never keeps, yet you keep believing his words instead of focusing on his actions. When someone truly values you, they don't require constant excuses to justify their behavior. They show up consistently, they take accountability, and they make a genuine effort to meet your needs. But if you've reached a point where you're constantly explaining away his shortcomings, it's time to recognize that you might be outgrowing the relationship. Making excuses for him can also look like blaming external circumstances for his lack of effort. You tell yourself that he's just stressed, that he's been busy, or that he doesn't mean to hurt you. While life does bring challenges, a man who truly cares about you will always find a way to be present. He won't use stress as an excuse to neglect your needs, and he won't let distractions keep him from making you feel valued. When you have to constantly justify why he isn't showing up the way he should, it's a sign that you've reached a different level of awareness in your relationship. You make excuses for him is by convincing yourself that your standards are too high. Maybe you've expressed your needs, but instead of him meeting you halfway, he makes you feel like you're expecting too much. You begin to lower your expectations, accepting less than what you truly deserve. But the truth is, the right man won't make you feel guilty for having standards. He'll step up because he wants to, not because you have to beg him to. If you're finding yourself settling for less while convincing yourself that it's enough, you need to ask yourself whether this relationship is truly in alignment with who you are becoming. You might also notice that your friends and family see the things you're trying to ignore. They express concerns, point out inconsistencies, or remind you of the things you once said you would never tolerate. Instead of facing the reality of the situation, you brush off their concerns, defending him even when you know they're right. When the people who love you the most see things clearly while you're still making excuses, it's a sign that you're holding on to something that no longer fits. At some point, you have to stop justifying behavior that doesn't align with what you truly want. You have to stop convincing yourself that things will change when all the evidence shows otherwise. The moment you realize you're making more excuses than he is making an effort, you have to acknowledge that you've outgrown the relationship. You no longer feel emotionally fulfilled in the relationship. And deep down, you know something is missing. In the beginning, you might have felt excited, connected, and hopeful about the future. But as time has passed, that emotional connection has faded, and you find yourself feeling more alone even when you're together. Conversations that used to be deep and meaningful now feel surface level, and you don't feel truly seen or heard by him. You may have tried to express your feelings, hoping he would understand and make an effort to meet your emotional needs, but instead, nothing really changes. You start to notice that the things that once made you happy in the relationship no longer bring you the same joy. The little things he used to do that made you feel special now feel routine or forced, and the bond you once shared feels weaker. It's not necessarily that anything drastic has happened, but you recognize that the emotional depth you once had is no longer there. You try to remind yourself of the good times, hoping that things will go back to the way they used to be, but a part of you knows that you've changed, and so has the dynamic of the relationship. You might also feel emotionally drained rather than fulfilled when you're around him. instead of feeling supported and uplifted, you feel like something is weighing you down. The relationship feels more like a responsibility than a source of happiness, and you no longer look forward to spending time together the way you once did. You may have moments where you convince yourself that you're just overthinking things, but the feeling of emptiness remains. A relationship should add to your life, not deplete you. And when you consistently feel emotionally unfulfilled, it's a sign that something isn't right. There's also the possibility that your personal growth has outpaced the relationship. You've been evolving, learning, and stepping into a higher version of yourself, but the relationship hasn't grown with you. What once felt like a good match now feels misaligned, and the connection no longer serves the person you are becoming. You may have different priorities, values, or visions for the future that don't align with his. While love and history may keep you attached, you realize that love alone isn't enough when emotional fulfillment is lacking. You're emotionally unfulfilled is that you started seeking fulfillment elsewhere. Maybe you confide in friends more than you do in him, or you find yourself fantasizing about a different type of connection. You might even feel more at peace when you're apart than when you're together. This doesn't necessarily mean you want to be with someone else, but it does mean that your emotional needs aren't being met in the relationship. When you find yourself craving something that should naturally exist within your partnership, it's a sign that you may have already outgrown the relationship. You find yourself constantly making excuses for his behavior, trying to justify actions that deep down you know aren't acceptable. In the beginning, it might have been small things, forgetting to call when he said he would, not showing up when you needed him, or dismissing your feelings. At first, you let it slide, convincing yourself that no one is perfect, that he's just busy, or that maybe you're expecting too much. But over time, these patterns continue. And instead of addressing them, you find yourself explaining them away to friends, family, or even yourself. You've created a habit of downplaying the things that bother you, telling yourself that it's not a big deal or that every relationship has its challenges. But deep down, you know that the respect, effort, and consideration you deserve aren't being met. You've started to convince yourself that if you just have more patience, if you just communicate better, or if you just give him time, things will change. But the reality is that the same issues keep coming up, and you're the one carrying the emotional weight of the relationship. You notice that you're the one making all the sacrifices, adjusting your schedule, compromising your needs, and going out of your way to keep the peace. You become so used to making sure he's happy that you've forgotten to check in with yourself. Are you happy? Are your needs being met? Are you receiving as much as you're giving? It's hard to admit, but when you take a step back, you realize that the relationship has become one-sided, and you're the one constantly bending to make it work. You've even started feeling anxious around him, worried about saying the wrong thing, or feeling like you have to walk on eggshells to avoid conflict. You used to feel safe and comfortable in the relationship, but now you feel like you have to manage his emotions, avoid triggering arguments, or suppress your true thoughts and feelings just to keep things going smoothly. The weight of constantly trying to keep the relationship stable has left you feeling exhausted. And instead of being a source of peace, the relationship feels like an emotional roller coaster. You've lost sight of who you are outside of the relationship. You used to have dreams, hobbies, and a clear sense of self, but now everything revolves around him, what he wants, how he feels, and how to keep him happy. The things that used to bring you joy have taken a backseat, and you barely recognize the person you've become. You've stopped prioritizing yourself because you've been so focused on making things work with him. You've started seeking emotional support elsewhere. When something exciting happens, he's no longer the first person you want to tell. When you're struggling, you find yourself turning to friends, family, or even journaling rather than talking to him. The relationship is supposed to be a place where you feel safe, supported, and understood, but instead, you feel unheard. The emotional gap between you continues to widen, and instead of trying to bridge it, you've unconsciously accepted that he's not the person you can truly lean on. Your priorities and values no longer align. Maybe at one point you both wanted the same things, but now it's clear that you're on different paths. You've grown, evolved, and changed, but he's remained the same or is headed in a direction that no longer matches yours. You want stability, but he still embraces inconsistency. You want depth and meaning in a relationship, but he keeps things surface level. No matter how much you try to ignore it, the reality is that you're no longer aligned in the way that truly matters. The effort in the relationship has become one-sided. You're the one making plans, checking in, and putting in the emotional labor to keep things going. You don't feel prioritized or valued, and it's become obvious that you're the only one trying. A relationship should be mutual where both people invest in making it work, but you feel like you're carrying all the weight. You've convinced yourself that if you just try a little harder, things will improve, but in reality, you've been trying for far too long without any real change. You've started wondering what life would be like without him, and instead of fear, you feel a sense of peace. The thought of moving on used to feel terrifying, but now it feels like a real possibility, one that doesn't seem as painful as you once imagined. You're realizing that holding on to something that no longer fulfills you is only keeping you from the happiness and love you truly deserve. You no longer feel excited about the future with him. There was a time when you envisioned growing together, making plans, and creating a life that aligned with both of your dreams. But now, when you think about the future, you don't see him in it the same way. Maybe you avoid conversations about long-term commitments, or you find yourself uninterested in what's next for the relationship. Instead of feeling joy at the thought of continuing this journey together, you feel uncertain, indifferent, or even trapped. The idea of spending more time with him doesn't excite you, it drains you. You've started compromising your happiness just to keep the relationship going. You find yourself constantly adjusting your needs, your values, and your boundaries just to avoid conflict or to keep him happy. You no longer express your true feelings because you know they won't be received with care. You suppress your desires, ignore your own emotional needs, and tell yourself that maybe you're expecting too much. But deep down, you know that you've been settling for less than you deserve. Instead of feeling fulfilled, you feel emotionally neglected, yet you keep holding on because you don't want to face the reality you may have outgrown him. Your intuition has been telling you that something isn't right. You've been feeling this way for a while, but you keep pushing it down, hoping that things will change or that you're just overthinking. But the truth is, your inner voice has been nudging you, trying to make you see what your heart already knows. Every time you've questioned if you should stay, every time you felt the weight of being unfulfilled, every time you sense that the love you're giving isn't being reciprocated in the way you need, it's been a sign. The longer you ignore it, the more restless you feel. You're no longer growing in the relationship. Relationships are meant to challenge us, help us evolve, and bring out the best in us. But instead, you feel stuck. You're not inspired, supported, or encouraged to be your best self. You're either stagnating or shrinking just to fit into a version of yourself that makes him comfortable. You've outgrown the relationship because it no longer nurtures your growth, your confidence, or your happiness. It's not helping you become who you're meant to be. It's holding you back. You feel lonelier in the relationship than you would on your own. Even when he's right next to you, it doesn't feel like he truly sees you. You crave deep emotional intimacy, but the connection has faded, and instead of feeling loved, you feel overlooked. You've tried to express your needs, but they go unmet. You've convinced yourself that staying is better than being alone, but in reality, you already feel alone in the relationship. It's a painful realization, but it's also the clarity you need to finally choose yourself. You no longer recognize yourself in the relationship. Somewhere along the way, you started changing in ways that don't align with who you truly are. Maybe you become more anxious, more insecure, or less confident in expressing your needs. You've adjusted your personality, your interests, and even your boundaries to accommodate the relationship, but in doing so, you've lost touch with your authentic self. You used to have certain standards, certain things you would never tolerate, but now you find yourself making excuses, justifying behaviors, or settling for less than you deserve. Instead of feeling free to be yourself, you feel like you have to shrink or change just to keep the relationship together. Your emotional needs are no longer being met. You've tried to communicate what you need. You've expressed what makes you feel loved, valued, and secure, but it's not being heard or honored. Maybe in the beginning he was attentive, affectionate, and emotionally present, but now it feels like you're pouring into the relationship without receiving anything in return. You feel like you're constantly giving, adjusting, and compromising, but your efforts are not reciprocated. Instead of feeling emotionally fulfilled, you feel neglected, unseen, and unappreciated. And the longer you stay, the more emotionally drained you become. You keep hoping he will change, but nothing ever does. Every time you bring up issues, he promises to do better, to try harder, to be more present, but the effort is always short lived. The cycle continues, things get better for a moment, but then he falls back into the same patterns. Deep down, you know that you can't force someone to change and you can't keep waiting for potential. You're holding on to what you believe he could be rather than accepting who he is. And the more time you spend hoping for something different, the more you delay your own happiness. The connection doesn't feel the same anymore. You remember what it used to be, the chemistry, the passion, the emotional closeness, but now it feels forced. Conversations don't flow the way they used to. Spending time together doesn't bring the same excitement, and intimacy feels more like a routine than a deep emotional bond. Maybe you've outgrown each other in ways that can't be repaired, or maybe you're simply no longer compatible. But instead of acknowledging the disconnect, you keep holding on to memories of how it used to be, even though the present reality is completely different. You're staying because of fear, not because of love. The idea of leaving scares you. Maybe you're afraid of starting over, of being alone, of not finding someone else. Maybe you're worried about hurting him or feeling guilty for walking away. But staying out of fear is not the same as staying out of love. Love should feel like security, peace, and fulfillment, not obligation, uncertainty, or emotional exhaustion. Holding on to a relationship that no longer serves you is keeping you from the love, joy, and growth you truly deserve. You have lost your sense of excitement and purpose in the relationship. In the beginning, everything felt fresh, engaging, and filled with potential. You felt inspired, motivated, and hopeful about the future you were building together. But now that spark has faded. You wake up every day feeling indifferent, going through the motions without any real passion or enthusiasm. Conversations feel repetitive. Time spent together feels more like an obligation than a joy. And deep down, you know that the connection is no longer serving you in a meaningful way. You've started imagining a different life without him. When you think about your future, you don't see him in it the same way you used to. Instead of picturing growing together, you find yourself fantasizing about a life where you feel free, happy, and unburdened. You think about how things could be if you weren't tied to this relationship, how you could focus on yourself, your growth, and your happiness in ways that feel impossible right now. The idea of moving on no longer terrifies you. Instead, it brings you a sense of relief, even if you haven't fully admitted it to yourself yet. Your goals and values no longer align. When you first got together, you may have had a similar vision for the future, but as time has passed, your paths have started to drift apart. Maybe you've grown in ways that he hasn't, or maybe his priorities have shifted in a direction that no longer resonates with you. You've tried to make compromises, to adjust your expectations, to hold on to the hope that things will align again. But the reality is that you're both moving in different directions. You want different things out of life, and staying in the relationship means sacrificing parts of yourself that you're not willing to give up. You feel more alone in the relationship than you would on your own. A relationship is supposed to be a partnership, a space where you feel emotionally supported, connected, and valued. But instead of feeling like a team, you feel isolated. You don't feel truly understood. You don't feel like your needs are prioritized. And you're tired of always being the one making the effort. You're with someone physically, but emotionally you feel distant. The emotional intimacy that once made you feel safe and cherished has been replaced by silence, misunderstandings, or a lack of genuine effort. You've realized that staying is holding you back from your happiness. No matter how much history you have together, no matter how much love you've given, you know that you're no longer growing in this relationship. You've tried to convince yourself that things will change, that if you just wait a little longer, things will get better. But deep down, you know the truth, this relationship is no longer in alignment with the person you are becoming. Holding on to something that no longer nurtures you is keeping you from stepping into the joy, peace, and love that is truly meant for you. Lastly, you start envisioning a future without him. The thought of moving on doesn't scare you as much as it used to. Instead, you start to feel relief at the idea of new possibilities. You realize that holding on isn't love, it's fear of the unknown. But deep down, you also know that staying in a relationship that no longer serves you is more dangerous than stepping into the unknown.